Thank you. I'm going to need about 2 minutes to set up. So if you want to stand up and stretch, please do so. Thank you. Where can I stick this? Okay. Thanks. Great. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Ah. Okay. Yep.
Should I call people to attention?
Yeah.
We've been singing that refrain. That seems to work, especially when I change the words, but I don't know if I have any words to say.
Good. I'm going to put this on here.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much for being with us.
Nice to be here.
You have called us by our name. We belong to you. Please join me. You have called us by our name, and we are yours. We are ready for our talk. Would you please sit down? Father Ricky's ready to go, and so are we. So once again, we welcome Father Ricky and invite you to be seated now as he shares his wisdom with us this morning. Welcome, Father Ricky.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Adam. See, I knew when I said 2 minutes, it's going to wind up being 3 or 4 minutes. So, I was coming down the elevator this morning for this presentation, and there were a bunch of us in the elevator, and Sister Mary Kay asked, how am I feeling? They all asked how I'm feeling. Well, I'm a bit nervous, but she says, oh, don't worry, we're a friendly bunch. And that is true. Everyone I've met so far, you've all been very friendly. Since I've been in religious life since 21 years old, since I was 21, and I've always believed that vocation directors are the role models, of our community, and that's what I've been experiencing. Yesterday during lunch, I sat next to Father Anthony Huynh, who's Vietnamese American, and I asked him, so how are the Vietnamese communities doing? Are they getting a lot of vocations? Because I know that the Vietnamese youth and young adult, the movements that they're doing, if you've ever been to those conferences, it's really extraordinary what they're doing. And he kind of told me, actually, we're not getting as many vocations as you might think. And the reason is, he was saying that first generation of Vietnamese who came here in the 1970s, they became, in some ways, the vocations that emerged today, but now we have these second and third generation Vietnamese Catholics, and they're not going into religious life and priesthood as we might readily think. And I don't know if you noticed that, but we kind of went from a shift, and this is the purpose of this intro, from looking at Vietnamese Catholics as a collective identity quickly into generational issues, right? And that came up yesterday during the Q&A. I like to say we went from what I would say a classical, traditional approach to anthropology, that cultural approach, right, to a sociological aspect of culture and how we look at collective identity. And so I'm glad I'm speaking second after the wonderful presentation by Father Van Tran, because I'm going to take that anthropological approach to culture and now go into the sociological realm of culture, a lot more so. When I was asked to give a presentation and a keynote to this group, Sister Debbie told me the theme was going to be borders, and I go, oh, that's perfect. This is wonderful because this is a lot of the themes I touch upon as myself now as a kind of self-proclaimed sociologist. That's why the title of this is called Borders, which is usually we right away think of an anthropological approach, and again, Father Van Tan talked about that wonderful understanding of the globalization and migratory patterns, how that's affecting vocations. But boundary is a term that a lot of sociologists use. It's a little bit more elusive. It goes into what social practices that we do. So that's the title of this, Borders, Boundaries, and Beyond, Culture in the 2.5 World, and I'll explain what that is, okay? I thought of three aspects, or three approaches to boundaries and culture and borders. Within the boundaries, I'm going to talk about two approaches to culture. One anthropological, not spend a lot of time on that, again, since yesterday's presentation did that marvelously, but one sociological. And then I'm going to talk about the second circle around the boundaries. And really, part 2 and 3 is going to get into that sociological realm that I've been doing a lot of research and studying and presentations on, around the boundaries, what the nuns could teach us about vocation ministry. And then the third circle I thought about when I was thinking about boundaries is beyond the boundaries, religion, media, and technology in a 2.5 world. So the first thing will kind of be an introduction or a primer, not a primer, that's something you put on the walls, but a primer on two approaches, classically speaking, traditionally speaking, to culture. By the way, this is a Prezi, P-R-E-Z-I. I'm going to give Sister Debbie the link to this so that you'll have access to it. Okay. Traditionally, there have been two approaches to culture, the anthropological and the sociological. I think when most Catholic leaders like ourselves or ministers, when we think about culture, we right away think of the anthropological. And we still need to look at that, obviously. All the various understandings of how we see collective identity groups. That origin came from 19th century Europe, right? Colonization. So in that whole process, we began to look at the other, and we began to create our own boundaries, identities of who they may be. And there's a lot of post-colonial theories we can get into, but we kind of looked at groups as presumably as whole entities. And of course, we're wrong. It gets much more complicated than that. But Gerald Arbuckle calls this like the billiard balls approach to culture. You know, American Indian, Alaskan Native, African Americans, as if they're particular cultural groups together, as if they're whole entities, etc. But in this approach to culture, features of collective identity groups, it's a system, this is a classic definition from Clifford Geertz, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which human beings communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about their attitudes of life. Mark Francis says culture understood more anthropologically is about how the group of people we belong to understand what is important in life and how we express and hand on these values in our daily life through our words, actions, and way of life. From cultural anthropological, that's what we've been talking about yesterday. In general, I could say as an example, in general, I want to stress that, traditional European American culture is individualistic. Traditional Asian American culture is more collectivist or communitarian. In general, you know, we can start as a starting point. African American gospel masses invite more spontaneity, improvisation than the worship style of mainstream U.S. European American culture in general. Or Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Filipino Catholics locate the sacred in the largest spectrum of everyday locations, whereas your American culture might tend to compartmentalize the sacred, per se. But if you go to the Philippines, and you go to a restaurant, you might see a napkin holder with a Marian devotion. I mean, it's everywhere, per se. Those are examples. And we know about this from our own studies and what we've been talking about. The sociological aspect of culture also comes around the same time with the Industrial Revolution at its root. And in this world where we look at, as you know, our Catholic ethics roots, the work settings, the conditions, all of that, there began to be social cultural practices that was kind of ways of lifting or escaping the grunge of the new 9-to-5, in quotes, work. And so these social activities took on culture as well, but traditionally from a sociological perspective. And so in this understanding of culture, it focuses on the production of material cultural artifacts and products. That also then led to social practices and activities that allow people to escape the cold and industrialized reality of the world. Sociality understands culture as a language, as customs, beliefs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories developed by members of all culture groups. So when I talk about consumerism or going to the movies or the art page, culture page of a newspaper, there's a newspaper out here in the lobby. It's a section, it's called the culture page. You're not going to find conversations about Aborigines. You're going to find, what's the latest movie? What's the latest cultural, social, civic things? That's what's going on here. And, when it comes to those social practices, all ethnic racial groups participate in them, per se. So that's why that sociological aspect expands, that understanding of a cultural identity group. It could be the arts, music, lowbrow, highbrow culture, right? It could be social, it's evolved into social identity, class, generation, gender, sexual orientation. I can no longer talk about inviting Hispanic young adult Catholics to our community without looking at these other social factors, right? You can't talk about, because in their mind, it's more about class, generation, gender, or sexual orientation, whatever it may be. It gets complex. It expands our understanding of culture. It gets into institutional political affiliations, political, Democrats versus Republicans and vice versa. Religious, the nuns, right? Other social cultural practices, consumerism, the use of media and technology. So all of these aspects affect, I believe, it has implications for our vocation ministries, what I'm trying to show. Particularly, as I'm going to talk about briefly, the cultural wars that's currently going on in polarization. We have, now having said both of these disciplines are borrowing from one another, right? Even within sociology and anthropology, we really can't create clear lines. We're kind of borrowing tools from one another in many ways. But that leads me to, the question about how do you see yourself in all of this? If I ask you that, we might right away, again, go to anthropological categories, race, ethnicity, but we have these other social cultural categories. And for some people, these might actually be more important than race and ethnicity. I might argue that even second, third generation of any ethnicity who are becoming more acculturated in U.S. mainstream culture, the other categories might be actually more important. Which is not to disregard the importance of race and ethnicity, particularly for first generation, right? But we still need to look at those areas as well. But if there's other people here who was born between 1965 and 1979, like myself, then we're forming a cultural group. I'm part of Generation X. Or it could be done by social class. And usually when I give a retreat or a larger day on this aspect, I ask you then to draw who you are. But I just want you to think, how do you locate yourself within the social cultural spectrum of Catholic identity? And we have many resources over the years, and I simply invite you to check that out. in culture and sociology, as far as the Catholic Church, what we've been doing. Certainly, we love to read Pew Research Now, CARA, all of those areas as well. Media and technology, which I'll be talking about in my third circle. And then the one aspect of this socio-cultural look at culture or the sociological that I want to highlight is what I think is the first order crisis today, the toxic polarization that we're living in and the culture wars. I say it's a first order crisis because we can't do anything. We can't talk about abortion, gay marriage, we can't talk about immigration, ecology as a Congress, as a community, even within your own communities, I want to presume. We can't talk about anything unless we talk about how we're talking about this, we're at this toxic level. It's not just divisions, it's so bad that, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul, I mean, it's getting into this moment where we're becoming violent, right? That's why I call it a first order crisis. And it has a different history. I give a long talk about this, but I'm not going to go into. Some people say it roots back to the Civil War. Some people are wondering whether we're going to come back to that. But it's been going on for 50, 60 years, which is why we're at the toxic level. And so just as a summary, in many ways, much of what was presented here points to the age-old dialogue between unity and diversity, a dialogue that was present at the beginning of Christianity 2,000 years ago, and one that will continue to be present 2,000 years from now, this side of the second coming of Christ. This broader spectrum of unity and diversity, which is really at the heart of our Catholicism, that was here 2,000 years ago, Council of Jerusalem, hello. And I want to say it's going to be here 2,000 years from now. Hopefully, don't get me wrong, hopefully we'll be less hostile and we'll be more unified. I'm not putting that down, we'll be getting better at that. But there'll always be other social cultural categories that will always splinter what we've known. Right now we have the multiple pronouns issues, right, going on in sociology, he, him, all of those things. Who would have thought that was going to emerge 50 years ago? So we'll always be this dialogue and dance between unity and diversity. Somehow we'll always need to look at both of those because there's a place for both. And when it comes to that understanding of anthropologically, again, all the various resources we have that talk about that. But what I say here is that while we have to consider those understandings of culture, we still need to consider also the sociological aspects. So bringing this part toward a conclusion, I think Father Von Tron already talked about this, learn from the various ethnic cultural communities. What can we do? I'd like to add, he was talking about it, the idea of story sharing narrative. That's the key. How do we learn to listen to one another? We can learn, the more you learn about various cultural groups, I think it might be a better tool for us as vocation ministers. For example, I mentioned that for the most part, Euro-American mainstream U.S. culture is more individualistic, right, than other culture groups which are more communitarian collectivist. There's a wonderful story I always love to share by Rufino Zaragoza. He said once it was at an LA convention, he was asked, he's a liturgist himself, he was asked to find a second reader who would be able to proclaim the reading in Vietnamese. And so he approached a Vietnamese woman and asked, would you be able to do the second reading in Vietnamese? And she said, yes, Father, yes, Father, yes, Father. At the time of the Mass, for the second reading, she never showed up. And what he learned after talking with the Vietnamese community there is that we usually have, in our mainstream U.S. culture, this kind of individualistic, my choice, my individual, I don't need to ask my community or elder to say yes or no. What Rufino should have done, and he shared this with me, he should have went to the whole Vietnamese community and go, we would love the second reading to be in Vietnamese. Could you choose among yourselves? He's approaching this communitarian, collectivist, not one-on-one. Would you be able to choose for yourself among you a member who would be able to come and participate in the second reading. That was a collectivist approach to liturgical preparation. How might that transfer to vocation ministry? Right? Do we still take a one-on-one, my choice, which is actually still legitimate? I'm not putting that down. Ultimately, there is an individual choice. But how might different strategies of communitarian collectivists also, particularly with cultures that kind of resonate with that, how might that? And you may have thought about this already, so I don't really know. But that's just an example. The more you read about these other culture groups, the more you can hopefully translate that and these resources. By the way, the USCCB, this website, the Culture Diversity Group, of which I'm a consultant, many resources. So please, if you have not read, Father Lin Huang's about Vietnamese Catholics, or I wrote the book on Filipino Catholics, you ought to, if you're vocation directors, you ought to be reading these resources to see their cultural worldview. In the world of sociology, I'm going to talk about the nuns, the media technology, but think about polarization these days, the cultural wars. I'm not going to get into this because it's going to be long, but actually the overwhelming majority of people are just exhausted, actually. And it's actually the extreme ends of both civic and religious leaders who are perpetuating the polarization. The majority of people are actually in the middle, much more nuanced, much more gray when it comes to moral issues and elections and all of that. The question I have for you then is, how is toxic polarization affecting your religious community life? You probably aren't even able to talk about elections on the table without some disruption. I don't know, or maybe you are. It depends on with whom you live. How do you respond to vocational inquirers, discerners, etc., who position themselves at extreme ideological ends? This is a question I'm interested in. How does that play into or come into your ministry? We created, the Paulist community created, we're going to be addressing this in the next 4 years at least. And we hope to have, I feel like I'm plugging, I am. We're going to have like a conference in 2 years, 2024, around the time of elections, to talk about toxic polarization. And I've been giving talks upon this myself. What I love about the talks is that I've been addressing clergy convocations. Because again, our leaders, not everyone, but the extreme ends, and only a small percentage are in the extreme ends who are kind of perpetuating these cultural wars. And I could talk about that in another day. That's one, but two, it's within the boundaries, because within the boundaries we have that interculturality going on and divisions, The second part, around the boundaries, what the nuns could teach us about vocation ministry, a kind of provocative title, because usually when we look at vocation ministry, I don't know, am I presuming that people who might come to you, possible inquirers or discerners, do you presume they're already within the boundaries? Maybe they are, I don't know. But it's just something we might learn from what the nuns are doing, how they are negotiating around Catholic institutional boundaries. Might there be some tools there that might help us in our vocation ministry? I believe there are, because when it comes to Catholic identity, it's very complicated. Even though they might, I'm going to presume, and I am, that if you do have candidates or discerners coming into, that they're also practicing some of these activities that nuns are doing, to lesser or greater extents. I don't know, but I just want to presume this might be another creative way of looking at your vocation ministry, because it's going on at a sociological level. And the primary book I want to use is my colleague, Elizabeth Drescher. She teaches at Santa Clara University. That's where I teach part-time. We created this group about 8 years ago. We began to look at questions about the nuns and teaching religious in institutional boundaries like Santa Clara University. I don't have to go through the data because you probably read all of that about the nuns. Okay, so I'm going to save a little time and go through this. But I also want to show the particularities. When we say nuns, by the way, that's a term that they do not usually like. That's usually a term that institutional leaders impose upon describing the other, per se. But they're different. But there are so many different categories and subcategories of those who are not affiliated, per se. And if you want to look at, I put here, we should look at the different definitions of those. You could look at it later. So Elizabeth Drescher kind of says the traditional approach of how we view evangelization, teaching, catechesis, etc., the Eucharist. The traditional view has always been that we focus on belief, belonging, and behaviors. What do we believe? So if you're thinking of becoming baptized Catholic, RCA, this is what we believe, the creed. What is membership, in North America, registration in a parish? In other countries, I should know that's not the case. But what does it mean to belong? Mass, going to Sunday Mass, all of that. And then what are your ethical behaviors? The moral, social justice, ethics, morality, all of that. And then we kind of say, once they teach them within the boundaries of an institutional church, parish, or school, we then send them out. And then they go out to proclaim. What Elizabeth Drescher contends is that model no longer works. There's still a place for it, but it no longer works because today's younger generation, as soon as you teach them that, they're already interrelating that with everything else beyond the boundaries and around the boundaries. Sometimes during my class, they're on their iPhones fact-checking me. Sometimes during homilies. I mean, the boundaries are being very porous and fluid in many ways. To the extent that you can control, that's fine, but it's maybe as soon as they leave the church or the building, they'll already be interconnecting with their Lutheran friends, their atheist friends, you know what I'm saying, or in the internet. So in our estimation, this is the actual context, per se. Now, there's still a place for this. I'm not knocking that down. But this is the context, okay? What Elizabeth Drescher has said is that nuns are actually more looking at being and becoming. I know it sounds very, what's that word I'm looking for? New agey, right? But this is based on her own research she interviewed, 100 nuns, per se. And what her data comes, I'm gonna bring this out a little bit more, is that nuns are actually, they might participate in Mass more than you might think. It might be once every 3 months, once every 6 months. It really varies. There's no one data. But they're also doing, as we all know, doing a lot of social justice ministry. They find more meaning in that. They might go to other forms of worship. They're exploring, they're seekers. You've heard those different social logics. So many are sometimes they're within institutional boundaries, sometimes they're not. But what she's found is that both this approach and this idea of being and becoming is more what they're doing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the 5 of these and then ask questions of implications for vocation ministry. What can we learn from nuns? By the way, it doesn't mean that they can't be critical of these practices they do. There's a place for that, and I'll talk about countercultural, positions we can take as well, particularly based on our tradition. But let's see what the nuns are doing based on Elizabeth's. They're gathering relationship tending. So she says, nuns value gathering and relationship tending. Drescher's study revealed that nuns are primarily relational rather than individualistic or institutional, highlighting interpersonal intimacy and connectedness. They are gathering and relationship tending with families, friends, local communities, and others across social networks, increasingly expanded and diversified through digital social media. That's where they're finding meaning, okay? To what extent, the question I have for you, to what extent does your vocation ministry interconnect to the broader spectrum and networks of interpersonal relationships that transpire beyond official church boundaries and/or religious community institutions, particularly through digital tools? Now, you're all kind of doing this I'm presuming you have, a Facebook site, right? That's going into the relational media, that's, in other words, Facebook, or rather Meta, or whatever it is now, is not just Roman Catholic. It's also that other space. So things like that. I'm presuming, what are some other areas that go beyond just official or your own religious communities? Because that's where the nuns may be located as well. They're drawing from a wide variety of religiosities and spiritualities. No surprise there, right? Nuns draw from a variety. Nuns are provisional and practical, changing on the basis of new experiences, resources, and life stages, and drawing on diverse resources across religious, philosophical, and other wisdom traditions. They are exploring the perceived wisdom of a wide array of spiritual teachers, self-identified as such or not, within and beyond conventionally recognized spiritual and religious categories. I thought about this, and I right away thought about the founder of the Paulist Fathers, Isaac Hecker. He himself was kind of an explorer and seeker because he was baptized Methodist, but he looked into Episcopalians, the Transcendentalism. Actually, the first 5 founders of our community were Protestant. So in some ways, there was this sense in my own Paulist community to kind of be like these explorers and seekers, looking at the various things. How does it apply to your ministry? I thought, to what extent do vocation inquiries, discerners, explore other religiosities and or spiritualities before choosing to consider a vocation in your community? Do such explorations fortify or hinder vocational growth and or commitment? I'd be interested in what you have to say to that. Everyday locations of meaning-making. Nuns are finding, encountering God or the other or Christ everywhere, in various locations. Going for walks has become their spirituality. The internet, and I'll talk about that in its third circle. Gardening, they might be forming gardening and then use that as a form of spirituality or prayer. Or, praying in the subway, which I often do myself now that I live in New York, in the midst of the chaos. So everyday lives of religious members, seminaries. Sometimes many of the features I remember when I was looking into religious life, we tend to highlight the important events, and rightly so. The liturgical, the highlight, but then also how are we exploring the everyday locations in our vocation promotion, because that's where nuns are also tapping into. How does that become a part of the broader spectrum of encountering Christ? My friend Susan Francois, and again, Facebook does this, these everyday locations. I love this. This is a Halloween party of the Paulist seminarians. See, but if I'm thinking of joining a community and I see that, I'm not just seeing the vows and the ordinary, but I see that, I right away say, and talk about community, right? One of the primary reasons why people think about vocations. Everyday locations. I was also struck, encountering God may take place anywhere and at any time. In addition to highlighting already known sacred times and spaces, how might vocation ministry also consider the interplay between so-called sacred zones of encountering Christ with everyday locations? So your website and the magazine I found at the back table, the vision, there's an article there. I was so happy to see this. I saw that here this morning when I looked in. But look at this article. It's in I think the latest issue or the last issue, but by what's her name? Sister Graciela, but it's called My Portable Prayer Life. This is great. I'm so happy to see this in a Vocation magazine. And she says, I used to think prayer only happened in a chapel, but my ideas about connecting to God have become wider and deeper. That's going to connect to the spiritual practices of nuns. See what I'm saying? Articles like that, features like that, particularly. So I'm so glad. I was so happy to see that. What else? I mean, you have to use your imagination, some of these examples, transfer that to your own vocation ministry. There's a delicate balance going on here, right? At one end, we have to continue, rightfully so, consider what do we believe, how do we belong, and how do we behave. That's still a value. I hope that never goes. But in addition to that, look at the everyday locations, right? More embodied than cognate. Nuns are more embodied. Nuns are sensate, social, more than cognitive, private, and interiorized. They honor the role of human bodies themselves as creative and expressive sites of the sacred. Human body good. They see this, right? And other, cultures, when I go to an African American Catholic gospel mass, their sense of the body, right? Or I spend time, I go to Hawaii I've been invited there to Chaminade, and whenever I experience like Hawaiian liturgies, that sense of the body. European Americans have their own sense, by the way, of the body, right? In fact, one of the things going on with Usually Revival is the idea of bringing back processions, So there's that own tradition we have as well. Questions? I know this will be provocative. Do our religious communities embrace whole bodily expressions and affective sensibilities as valid sites of encountering Christ? What are women religious communities? Oh, it's my experience that women religious communities in their liturgies do a better job at ritual embodied sensibilities, than other communities. That's my experience, And so there's something there when I go to a liturgy. When I was a seminarian in D.C., I used to go to the Carmelites in Baltimore now and then, or Mary McGann when I was at WTU in Berkeley, who's an authority of African American worship. The liturgies there, we used our bodies, and it was just wonderful experiences of seeing the sacred in that. Other questions: what are the current issues, concerns regarding sexual and gender identities when accompanying inquirers and discerners? That could be a whole other day. Okay. There's a countercultural part to this. How might our Catholic ethics and moral traditions, for example, the dignity of the human life, offer an alternative to our culture of death, right? So, and how might that be used as a promotion, highlight when it comes to vocation ministry? This is just, I'm trying to connect it. I'm wondering what image of the human body connects with the charism of your religious community? What body image does your charism project? Whatever it is. It might be telling, whatever it is, there's no judgment. I'm just wondering what are the images of body when it comes to that? And then finally, being and becoming. Nuns tend to highlight experiences for authenticity and connectedness in the present moment, rather than future-oriented expectations, traditionally associated with salvation or various other afterlife schemas. They are dynamic over time while remaining coherent within identity narratives. They are narrating the spiritual life through a distinctive discourse that highlights fluidity, provisionality, diversity, unpredictability, wonder, and awe in human experience over time. So they're looking at this lifelong, and we're also living longer. So they're taking that, and there's a fluidity, provisionality going on. What are the present concerns of the younger generations with regard to lifelong commitment? How do vocation ministers guide or accompany them during section navigations? How do we recognize that that's a factor? To be countercultural, again, not everything that the nuns do might be compatible with our Catholic tradition or scripture, right? So but I wonder, how does the vowed life as a countercultural response to the fluidity, provisionality, commitment, right? There's talk, and I've seen different debates about whether Generation Y or millennials are actually committed, right? Those, I don't know if you've seen those when it comes to work, and there's actually two sides or some arguments about that. But when it comes to that, I wonder the idea of a vowed life, as being committed, might that be a countercultural response to this fluidity of provisionality as well? As well as embracing it, how do we also become a countercultural response to it? I'm a both-and theologian. And I think I usually take that when it comes to pastoral theology, how do we look at all those? So there's a delicate balance. How do we continue what we believe, belong, but then how might we learn from what the nuns are doing in a context where the boundaries are always being negotiated? Because we can't take that away from them, per se. I could take the iPhones away from my students, but right away, there will always be this interplay that they bring into institutional boundaries, worship sites, or any kind of official sites, right? That delicate balance between the cultural accompaniment, what are the good aspects, the positive aspects that nuns are doing, but then also the countercultural. There's a tricky balance there that we need to look at. One of the best examples of that, the new evangelization conferences that go on in Manila, they've been going on, for maybe, 5-6 years. I went to maybe 3 of them, but it takes place in Santo Tomas University in Manila, and there's Cardinal Tagle. Now, this is going to be an example, by the way, of being both countercultural, but also accompanying cultural practices, social cultural practices. And so at this Mass, Cardinal Tagle, at the end of Mass, right before the final blessing, he told all 7,000 young adults, Filipino young adults, to take out their iPhones or smartphones. It's like, what? During Mass, right? Now, and he even said something like, and if you've been using it, shame on you. So there's that countercultural response. But now you can take it out. You see what I'm saying? And then what he said, I want you to think about someone in the world that you want to text this to, and I forgot the exact words, but let's say he said, it was a theme of the scripture readings or his homily. He says, go out to all the world and proclaim the good news. Think about someone you're going to send that to, but don't do it yet. And then so he did the closing prayer, the deacon then did the dismissal, then he counted to 3, and it went out. Now, it was countercultural, right? But it was also accompanying, a buzzword we've been hearing, right? Pope Francis, accompany the social cultural practices to see the good ways that media and technology could be used in our Catholic faith. By the way, the Catholic Church is one of the largest, if not the largest, social institution that uses media. Okay? So but he used it as a way, and officially, he is a cardinal after all. It actually happens after Mass, because Mass technically ends after the deacon says, go for it, the Mass is ended. So, very clever, okay? Very clever. That tricky balance, it's not ignoring it or saying that media or that is evil. No. Why do we always think that media and technology could be evil? It takes time, as I'm going to talk about in this next circle. It's 10 o'clock. I got one more circle to go. Let's stand up in place. I always say this because I don't have the best lower back. If you need to go, you may, but I'm going to continue in about 37 seconds. I actually do this in class when I teach part-time at Santa Clara University. I tell my students, if there's ever a time you want to stand, even if it's after 5 minutes, go to the back of the class if you want to do yoga, whatever. It's very California, Santa Clara is in Silicon Valley. But I do believe sitting is one of the worst things that we could ever do. So I actually have a stand-up desk. Okay. Please be seated. Are you with me? All right, this is a lot of information overload, I realize, but I'm going to give you the Prezi link to this. Third circle, beyond the boundaries, religion, media, and technology in a 2.5 world. I'll explain what 2.5 means, by the way. So, how media is stretching the boundaries of religious community identity and Roman Catholic identity, for better and for worse. Okay? We're going to look at all those different things. What is a 2.0 world? Well, 2.1 is between 1992 and 2005, the World Wide Web, basically, the digital information highway. Most parishes' websites that I go to in the US are still stuck in the 1.0 world. Really, most parish websites are really electronic bulletins. It's information. It's digital information. That's 1.0. You know, what about your religious vocation sites, by the way? I haven't looked at all. I just wonder, is it still at 1.0? I just want you to, think about that. And have not advanced to 2.0 world. And most countries, actually in my experience, most countries outside of the US do not even have 1.0 websites when it comes to some parishes or communities. The 2.0 world, I'm not going to read this. It's basically more interactive, much more interactive, higher processes, right? Videos, right? But there's also sometimes live chats. There's also, because of the connectivity, the band has just become much more accessible. Do your vocation sites have that? Because that's where a lot of the younger generation, not just the younger generation, a lot of people are honing in more on those areas. What I want to do, I want to talk about this. This is a discipline in sociology, media, religion, and technology. But there are 5 theories when religion meets technology and media. And it's coming out of this group, Digital Religion, Social Media, and Culture. They're out of University of Colorado. I've been to a couple of their conferences. They're sociologists, so they're not theologians. Well, some of them are theologians, like I myself. I might go to these. And they're just looking at the intersection when media meets tech, but they love religion, but want to know about how is media and religion and technology, how are they influencing one another in this kind of world? And Stuart Hoover wrote this book. He summarized 5 issues that when religion and technology mean to come together, 5 issues that have emerged based on all the speakers and writers on this area when it comes to media, technology, and religion. The first issue, he says, that all of these writers somehow hint about is the issue of the new. We need to understand the extent to which new forms of mediation have real affordances and potentialities, new opportunities, right? Whenever something new comes out, here's a new opportunity we can do with technology. Communication and mediation are processes that are open to all of us. It is part of the human. I want to save time. So new technologies always come out all the time, and we've all now. I don't like to say this because we've all experienced this the last 2.5 years. One of the things that I've been talking about that the pandemic has done is that it catapulted us 10 years to 15 years into the future. All of a sudden, parishes, vocation ministers had to learn about Zoom, had to learn new technology. The pandemic has forced, and as you know, there are some challenges as that. So that's just the first area, which you've been experiencing already, whether it's Zoom interviews to this, to the challenges of learning. But that's always going to be an issue, the latest technology. And someone brought up yesterday the interrelationship between religious life, new technology, and intergenerational learning. That's part of this in religious life, right? In religious community. The issue of the scale of change. Hoover suggests that wholesale scales of change in religious practices, such as virtual worship, have not taken the place of brick-and-mortar church-building worship. What he's saying here is that usually when something new comes out, we right away think that, it becomes a threat to religious and civic institutions. All of a sudden, everything's going to change now that this new technology happens. And he says we're actually wrong. If you recall, this Second Life that came out in 2003, we can be avatars inside, a virtual world. I remember some theologians saying, that's going to take the place of people going to Mass, And actually, it was proven wrong. People still went to Mass. We still have to see what goes on with the pandemic, and I have some thoughts on that. But my point is, sometimes it's not that much of a leap as much as we may think. Just like remember when Blockbuster Video came out, they said no one's going to go to the movies. Well, we still are. You see. Now and again, the pandemic has catapulted us 15 years to 20 years into the future. So it's going to be interesting what comes out of that. But why is that? What is it about real life that still technology and media has not replaced. What does this have to do with religious community, religious vocations? How might you market that, promote that in your ministry? Now, what is interesting is what I call the acceleration factor. It's not that new technology is coming out, but once a new iPhone comes out, then all of a sudden it used to be every year, now it's like every 6 months. And technology has always been here. We began, look what the printing press did to religion and Christianity, right? But then it might have taken another 100 years for another technology. But it's getting faster and faster. That's what scares me, the acceleration rate. So how does the acceleration factor impact vocation ministry? And also, to be countercultural, how does your community's charism, prayerful life, gospel witnessing, vowed life, etc., provide a counterbalance to the ill effects of media and technological acceleration? And how might this factor be promoted in vocation ministry? What is it that you offer, in this cacophony of sound, technology, and acceleration that they might not experience? I'm going to come back to parts of that later. 3, the problem of authenticity. That's always going to be an issue whenever religion meets. In other words, what is real? Right? This happened with live stream mass. Does this count if I go to a live stream mass, or is it authentic? Obviously it doesn't count as obligation, right? But those areas of what is authentic, and we're still grappling with that. Now that we've all done, I'm presuming, hybridity, i.e. virtual and in person, what are the pros and cons that are coming out of that? Because I also want to say that's going to continue, Right now, in person, what Teresa Berger, theologian from Yale, says, close proximity is still more important, obviously, because you cannot replace that yet. So that still is the most valuable way of interacting and communication. But of course, we can now go across the seas. We can now have Zoom conferences and save money, especially with the prices of plane fares these days. The issue of reflexivity of self-consciousness. To what extent are religious and diocesan communities aware that they are integrating the words of meaning technology into everyday life? Are we being self-reflective of what's actually going on, or are we just using the latest technology? I remember when I said, I don't know when it was, I got my first email and said, I'm only going to give my address to 20 people. Or I'm only going to read 10 emails. I'm only going to check my email twice a day. Or I'm only going to give out my cell phone number. So whenever you get a new cell phone number, I'm only going to give it out to 20 people, no more. All of a sudden, I have someone to pick me up at the airport. And are we being self-reflective of how technology media is affecting us? This is where the moral issues come in, and ethics, right? Zoom fatigue, right? The upcoming 3.0 world. I'm saying we're at a 2.5 world because we're kind of in between. The 3.0 world, you know what that's going to be? AI, artificial intelligence. Whoa. So we have to be self-reflective of this, and now there are going to be studies out about fatigue. There's already studies about addiction to porn, right? Addiction to all these social media things. We have to keep balance. We have to always look at these issues, how it's affecting vocational life as well. The issue of authority is what Hoover says is the last one. Obvious, right? Finally, and not surprising, digital media, Hoover writes, contest authority because they enable, encourage, and interact with a wide range of social and cultural contexts and practices. Doctrinal authority thus faces new forms and sources of symbolic and narrative resources. Clerical authority faces new locations, communities, and means of practices. Basically, people have options, So they're always going to be contesting authority through their own means, whether they're valid or not, correct or incorrect. But the options are there, and that will always challenge us. That will always challenge us, institutional and religious authority, our doctrinal beliefs, all of that. How is the practice of challenging church authority and doctrine via immediate accessibility to a plethora of available resources affecting your vocation ministry. Okay, I'm coming towards the end. Oh, summary of this first part. Media and new technology continue to be fruitful tools in vocation ministry. But as a result of new levels of interactivity, coupled with the acceleration pace of ongoing developments in these fields, various models and practices of ministerial hybridity suddenly have emerged due to the pandemic, which in turn have challenged institutional, or continues to challenge, institutional conceptions about what is authentic and authoritative. As such, religious institutions need to be more intentionally self-reflective in the utilization of these new media and technology tools and how they influence pastoral and vocational ministries, particularly as we look ahead toward the soon-to-arrive 3.0. So don't pull back with this. Continue to, or know how to, I've been saying this when I give this talk to diocese. If your parish wants to pull back in live stream mass, okay, but then might you know within your diocese, particularly like the cathedral, you might not do a live stream mass with us, but if you are homebound, go to the cathedral. You know what I'm saying? So how do you pull resources together if you don't have the technological know-how? Even you among yourselves as a group, are there intercollaborative strategies of technologies and media? Proposed responses promote elements that religious life, vocation offers that digital new media and technology do not. Physical close proximity rituals, community life with living and breathing human bodies, etc. How are you promoting that? When I give this talk to parishes or dioceses, this is a made-up advertisement because I sat down and go, how might I put my theories to practice? And this is where I'm living, St. Paul the Apostle Church. And I made this up, so it's not actual. St. Paul the Apostle, but look, I'm pulling the categories that nuns are practicing, being and belonging, but I'm kind of Christianizing them. I'm making, by the pictures. So for community life, or belonging, right? That's a strong, I'm showing baptism there. For being, whatever that may be. Reconnecting is a word I use because we're in such a digital world now. So in my promotion, I'm kind of using these words to invite them to something they may not experience otherwise. We have a great LGBTQ ministry at St. Paul the Apostle Church. Jim Martin is like around the corner from us. I put that in our advertising. It looks at how we embrace the human body. You see what I'm saying? I'm just using these different things of how I would advertise St. Paul the Apostle Church. Whether they do or not, I don't know. but that's what I'm trying to pull that together. I don't need to put the street number. I could say Columbus Circle, New York. They could look it up themselves. I'm thinking like that. Number 2, become more mindful. Don't be naive that as technologies improve, and they will, virtual physical sensation will become more, quote, real, albeit virtual more real, holodecks, so will the emergence of new measuring sticks of what constitutes authentic encounters with Christ, and by extension, religious vocation. Technology is always going to be this interplay between progression, advancements, and then grappling that with what is still the perceived wisdom or what accounts for presence, whatever. That's going to continue. This is why you have to continue this because, the acceleration factor, but look at the ethics. Despite the challenges to authority that exist due to the plethora of options, what I'm saying is we still need resources in this. And when I looked, actually there were some Vatican documents that talked about this, media technology. Pope Francis has talked about that at the USCCB website. If you haven't read the social media guidelines, great guidelines that talk about ethics, in the use of media and technology. Oops, I'm going to continue there. And let me give this a summary, or rather an overview again. I began by talking about within the boundaries. We looked at that classical, I should say, anthropological approach to culture, which we still need to do. But then I also looked about the sociological aspects, highlighting what my estimation is the present first crisis, cultural wars and polarization going on in the world. How might all of these continue to affect our own vocation ministries? I looked at what the nuns could teach us about vocation ministry. Not to judge them, but rather what might we learn from what they're doing? How do we accompany them and do this delicate balance between our belief, belonging, behaviors coupled with what younger generations are doing in their social cultural practices in a context that's always shifting and boundaries are being fluid. And then finally, I offered 5 theories of the intersection between religion and technology, and how might that challenge us, but also continue and hopefully inspire us to continue to use such tools. Concluding thoughts, many of the things I said is the age-old religion and science, or I should say at least since the Enlightenment. But even then, there's always been this idea of technology and religion and faith. So at one level, this is actually not new, especially in Roman Catholicism. I always believed had a good handle of how we balance both religion and science in some ways. I remember when I proposed my dissertation to Mary McGann, and it was all about, I was bringing all these sociological data, sociology of religion, some of the things I said to her, and in my dissertation proposal, and she goes, "But Ricky, you're not getting a degree at UC Berkeley next door," and I took courses at UC Berkeley, You're getting a degree in Graduate Theological Union. Where is the theology? Where is the faith? And so the last chapter of my dissertation was about divine initiative, how in the sea of all these social scientific tools and culture, both culture and tools don't have the last word, right? This is larger faith dimension. We have to borrow, we have to continue to borrow from them, not throw that away, but so that question I asked you, how do we, in light of everything I've been sharing with you, where is the life of faith, and how do we see God initiating this? And continuing that, and that's the last point I want to make, the Holy Spirit. Some of this might have been like, whoa, overwhelming. No, this is not new at one level. The acceleration rate might be new, but we're continuing. But there's always something new whenever we are introduced to what's going on when we consider the larger cultural context. In this case, a social cultural context. That's how the Spirit works. Not to be fearful is my point. I think if we have to embrace and critique, but for us to be cooperative, this might be how the Holy Spirit is moving us to different paradigms of our ministry and to different paradigms of what it means to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church. I hope this helps. God bless. Thanks. Thank you. Shamelessly advertising.